August is here, and that means that the weather and the election cycle are heating up. The best way to beat the heat and stay up to date on the latest news from the US election to international breaking headlines is to become a DSR member and gain access to additional content across our network, in addition to other exclusive benefits. Use code BEATTHEHEAT to get 50% off of your membership and sign up today at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. That's Beat the Heat at thedsrnetwork.com/buy. Now please enjoy the show.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. In New York City on Thursday, Donald Trump delivered something that was billed as a speech about the economy. In it, he was addled and confused, rambled incoherently at several different moments, and launched into some really bizarre non sequiturs. So what was the New York Times' headline on its initial news story about the speech? Well, it was totally straight. Trump calls for an efficiency commission, an idea pushed by Elon Musk. Sounds pretty sane, right? Well, the speech wasn't all that sane. So this all raises a question. Is the press doing an adequate job of analyzing Trump's mental fitness for the presidency? We think the answer is an emphatic no. And today we're discussing this with Meredith Shiner, a former reporter who wrote a recent piece for the New Republic, arguing that Republicans have so successfully worked the refs in recent years that the press corps now has a great deal of trouble telling the basic truth about the Trump-era GOP. Good to have you on, Meredith.
It's great to be here, Greg. It's been a while.
It has. And you were in the belly of the beast. You worked as a reporter from, 2009 to 2016 in D.C.?
Yeah, the last time I saw you, I think it was probably in the Capitol, and I was a baby reporter for Politico. So I think we've all seen a lot since then.
And things have really changed a lot.
But the media hasn't, and that's why we're here today.
Exactly. So Trump gave this speech on Thursday at the Economic Club of New York. He called for a new commission to be headed by Elon Musk, supposedly to cut waste and fraud in government. He talked about making his tax cuts on the wealthy and corporations permanent, and again vowed across-the-board tariffs on imports, which economists say would raise costs on consumer goods for ordinary families, set off a global trade war, etc. And then there were moments like this one, when he was asked what specific policies he would implement to make childcare more affordable. The audio is courtesy of Aaron Rupar. Listen.
Well, I would do that, and we're sitting down. I was somebody, we had Senator Marco Rubio, and my daughter Ivanka was so impactful on that issue. It's a very important issue. But I think when you talk about the kind of numbers that I'm talking about, that, because, look, childcare is childcare. There's something, you have to have it. In this country, you have to have it.
Okay, you all heard that. After this, Trump segued into a discussion of tariffs, which also rambled endlessly. Meredith, this is clearly someone who has no idea what he's talking about. He's filibustering. As a general matter, your observations of Trump, is this getting worse or not?
I think we have to start from a place that it was always bad. Trump was never really focused on politics or policy, and he was never held accountable for his lack of understanding of how the government worked or how the economy worked. But if we're talking about pure delivery, what we've seen in the past few months, to the degree that he's actually been out in the public, has clearly been worse. It's clearly been less coherent. But when you think about the seminal moment of this campaign, which was the debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, I think one of the reasons why Joe Biden's poor performance and lack of coherence got so much more attention is because in the last election in 2020, he was putting together cogent thoughts. And for Donald Trump, his baseline on how he was graded was so much lower that people saw a more extreme change in Joe Biden, and they weren't really seeing Donald Trump because they were writing it off as like, oh, that's Trump being Trump. But now that we're in this place in the election and we're really focused on him and the media is focusing on him, it is harder to justify the cherry picking of the one or two lines that seem to fit the assignment as it's ever been in his history of being a political figure.
To your point, the initial Times piece on this speech had that straight headline I mentioned earlier, and it treated this event as a serious one. At one point, it mentioned that the speech was meandering, but you had to read to like the gazillionth paragraph for any real mention of the fact that he launched into all kinds of weird tangents and that he made a bunch of stuff up.
I think that if we're in this place where suggesting a policy that was hatched by Elon Musk, who is just obviously now a known Nazi who bought a platform so he could spew his general garbage into the universe, if that's the thing that you can pick to try to make this legitimate and serious, everyone's losing here.
Well, I mean, anybody reading this Times piece will have no idea what actually happened during that speech. This is my issue.
Yeah.
One of the big problems here is that the press is faced with this kind of conundrum when it deals with Trump. He says some stuff that's kind of superficially about policy, and he says a whole bunch of other stuff that's absolutely crazy, that's rambling, that's incoherent. And so they have to pick and choose, and the current sort of mindset of the press directs them to cherry pick the stuff that's not crazy. And that creates a real problem in the discourse, doesn't it? Can you talk about that?
Of course. You know, I teach public policy students at the University of Chicago. And one of the things that I always teach them is that their superpower is their power of selection. That what we see in the media and journalism is all the outgrowth of a series of choices. What an editor assigns that day, how a reporter tackles it, what quotes they choose for the piece, and how the outlet itself characterizes that news or prioritizes that news. When people picked up physical papers, we could actually really see that manifestation of what was at the top of the fold. A bunch of human people were deciding that that was the most important story in the country today. So, of course, when you choose certain things that Donald Trump says, because you think that that's the most normal part of the political discourse or what he is trying to convey, you are, of course, making a decision on who you are presenting to the world. And I think we're all naive if we think that the New York Times, for as many gripes as we have with it, doesn't have an outsized role in shaping the conversation and the narrative around our politics. And I think the thing that I tried to emphasize in my piece for the New Republic is that the old rules of DC journalism, which have not been amended or adapted, maybe in the modern era, that emphasized bipartisanship as an outcome, that emphasized savvy takes, that was basically based on this insular world that they built for themselves. I want to take a 20-second time out to talk about the recent interview that Dana Bash did of Kamala Harris on CNN. And I flipped into that coverage, and they were talking about fracking for 35 minutes. That was their big thing, is that they thought they got her in a gotcha about fracking. And that was the entire conversation. And that couldn't be further from the interests or the point of view that average people who care about this country, and I think that there are a lot of us, really care about and want to hear from their political leaders and the people who are vying to run this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's probably a targeted population that cares a great deal about fracking, but I think your point is key. And if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that what they're operating from is kind of an outdated sense of what constitutes making news. And that's, something that gets their colleagues, their journalistic colleagues, chattering and talking. And so if you can get the candidate in a gotcha, well, you've done something good.
Yes, and no one else cares, and I think that's
right. That's the thing.
Like when we talk about Donald Trump and his role in our politics and in our history, and this is what I really tried to articulate in the piece. He didn't break the Republican Party. He was the natural outgrowth of the Republican Party, starting with Reagan. What he broke were the absolutely antiquated, out of touch with reality rules of Washington, D.C. When he stood up on that first debate stage and was insulting Rosie O'Donnell, instead of being in his Navy suit talking about the national debt, being a little robot that was trained over years of Sunday talk show appearances, he broke the paradigm for what they thought political journalism should be. Their commitment to holding on to the status quo, of trying to go back to normal and dinners and hanging out at Cafe Milano, all of the stuff that matters to them but doesn't matter to real people, that is what is creating this widening gap. And that is, I think, the trend that we're seeing now, which is that people who really cared about politics, particularly people on the left and progressives, were always sort of complaining about the national media and the political media and how they were covering some of these issues. But now we're seeing less active people wonder why the New York Times and the national media is out of touch, because truly the media is saying one thing and people are seeing things with their eyes that don't match up with the analysis that they're hearing in real time. And that rift is actually an existential threat for the political media as we know it.
How is the new diploma divide separating Democratic and Republican voters? Matt Grossman and David A. Hopkins take a closer look in their new book, Polarized by Degrees, published by Cambridge University Press. Over the past several decades, American society has experienced fundamental changes, from shifting relations between social groups and evolving language and behavior norms to the increasing value of a college degree. These transformations have polarized the nation's political climate and ignited a perpetual culture war. In a sequel to their award-winning collaboration, Asymmetric Politics, Grossman and Hopkins draw on an extensive variety of evidence to explore how these changes have affected both major parties. Using an objective and analytical approach, Polarized by Degrees explains the growing political divide between Americans with and without a college degree. The result of this diploma divide is an increasingly complex world in which everything is about politics, and politics is about everything. Buy your copy of Polarized by Degrees now at cambridge.org/Polarized by Degrees. It's a real problem. And so here's a good example of it. Another part of the speech where he talked about a standoff with migrants in Aurora.
Aurora, has anyone been there? I think you'd better stay away for a little while. They had AK-47s, the ultimate guns, AK-47s. They can blow lots of people away real fast. And the sheriff didn't want to touch him. Nobody wants to touch him. Sheriff, there's 18 Venezuelans attacking my building. Would you please come over and straighten out the situation? He's got a deputy. You know what they say? Well, no thanks. Let's call in the military.
Okay, Meredith, all that was during a speech about the economy. There's a line or two in the Times piece that mentions this, but here again, there is no way that someone reading those sentences in the Times would have the faintest clue what Trump was actually like, how incoherent and off-topic and kind of addled he appeared as he was doing this. As you say, a lot of people get their news from the New York Times, and the way the Times frames stuff shapes how a lot of smaller news outlets all over the country present stuff. And what I don't get is why journalists don't admit that this is a problem. That's the thing I don't understand.
I don't want to speak for all journalists, and I don't want to make it seem like this is just a New York Times problem. I think this is widespread with cable news and the Washington Post. But I think there's a really important distinction that your listeners should consider, and it is the difference between a director and a documentarian. And I think right now, our political media feels like their role is to direct. They have certain parameters that they've gotten used to over decades of coverage, and they're trying to make this into something that it is not, versus documenting, versus really, truly talking about what has happened. And instead of trying to pundit their way out of a box, describe the inside of the box that they're seeing. You know, a perfect example of this recently, too, and one that I address in the piece, is the August 7th announcement of Tim Walz as Kamala Harris's running mate. If you only listened to the CNN coverage and the conversation, you would think she had made the most horrific error of her political career, that this was a fatal mistake, that because she didn't choose Josh Shapiro because Republicans said she should choose Josh Shapiro, that she was going to lose an election. Meanwhile, what we saw, the image of the stadium behind the set that they had constructed in the stadium in Philadelphia, was a stadium full of excited people. They are filling stadiums with people who are excited and energized by this ticket, and all the media can talk about is whether or not they're continuing to miscalculate. And so you're seeing these really weird mirror images of each other where they're trying to direct Donald Trump into something more serious than he is and to mold him into someone who plays this sort of traditional political figure role. And then they're also at the same time trying to distort energy and enthusiasm on the Democratic side of the ticket. Meanwhile, I think overall, there is not a strong enough understanding by the average people of like what kind of democracy crisis we're living in now, the threat that the Supreme Court poses to us and to democracy. And so all of these issues are scrambled and people are really upside down. And I think also generally afraid of what Donald Trump can do. And so I don't know how to bridge those gaps. I don't know why there aren't more journalists who at least publicly admit any sort of failing in the past 8 years of political coverage. But what we know about the world is that accountability and transparency is the only way to move forward. And there's been no real accountability and transparency from these outlets about the role that they've played in helping to contribute to this political moment. And so that's sort of what's creating this overall crisis that we're all experiencing. And that's, I think, why you're seeing more and more people feel like what is happening in the media, political, industrial complex is totally separate from their lived experience in the world and also what they're seeing when they're watching raw footage. Like what you see on C-SPAN is different than what you're experiencing on CNN or MSNBC.
No, it's very clearly true. And on the accountability problem, I don't believe that there's been any serious reckoning at the New York Times of all the saturation coverage of Hillary Clinton's emails, which clearly played a major role in that outcome and was shown to have been over the top in all kinds of ways by facts that emerged later. I want to bring up another problem here, which is that the coverage very rarely analyzes Trump's mental state, his mental fitness for the presidency as itself being the central issue at moments like these. Okay, during this speech, Trump went on other weird tangents. He said, one of his favorites, oh, well, next time we'll have this event in Venezuela where it's safer than the United States. He talked about migrants at all kinds of length. He said at one point that Kamala Harris is a communist fascist, something like that, some jumble of words. It was just sort of an endless stew. But you don't seem to see intense journalistic scrutiny of Trump's kind of mental capacities, right? Which should focus on the addled rants, the incoherence, the sadistic abuse of language, the total lack of curiosity about complex issues. And yet we had all that coverage of Biden's age and cognitive struggles, which, fine. That coverage was premised on the idea that his mental fitness for the presidency was something that the nation should care about. And yes, it should.
Yeah, we could do better than both of those two guys. Yes, but
right.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is also really important and going to this credibility crisis for the media, because this was something that people tuned into. Like this summer was a little bit of a political roller coaster and people were paying attention and people were like, yeah, we think both of these guys are old and we want different options. Like that's a normal person response to what we are seeing. And the idea that there was all of this feverish coverage from the mainstream media outlets, that the New York Times editorial board said Joe Biden must step aside for the good of the country. They've never done that with Donald Trump. And so, yes, authoritarianism and creeping authoritarianism should be a central conversation in our country. Like what democracy should look like and how we protect our democracy should be a central conversation. But if we're just going to go off the baseline of what we already saw this summer and how Joe Biden was treated, I think that that's where, again, average people who aren't as in the weeds as we are, look at that coverage. It was big enough that they perceived it and they were talking about it and they absorbed it. And then we're seeing this and there's nothing. And that can't possibly make sense to a normal person. And it certainly doesn't make sense to anyone who's paying attention. And it raises the question, of why these outlets are so unwilling to introduce any internal mechanism of accountability. Like the New York Times got rid of its public editor, and when then editor-in-chief Dean Baquet said he was doing it, he said Twitter replaced their public editor, and that was always a BS position. Because the idea of a public editor is to have a reporter within your newsroom that helps create understanding for people who aren't in politics and media about decision-making, that gets to ask hard questions within a newsroom, and then gets to have a point of view about whether or not what the newsroom did was correct and was in the service of the readers. And I think that the people who make decisions at these big outlets have really lost the thread in terms of what is in the service of their readers.
I'm somewhat sympathetic to the problem journalists face here. Like in a case like this, they're supposed to report on what Trump says about the economy. And he did say some things about the economy. But the problem is covering that just doesn't do justice to what we saw with the speech. And here's my issue. If you bring this up with journalists and editors at the big news organizations, I'm just basing this on Twitter interactions and things like that, which you've seen, they often just won't admit that it's even a problem. And what I don't get is, do reporters and editors really think they've got the problem of covering Trump aced, that they've got it down perfectly, that everything's just fine?
I worked in the Capitol building for 7 years, almost every day. Any day that the Senate or the House was in, I was in that building and I was working alongside reporters. And, you know, I think some people read my media criticism and they think it's because I have a disdain for media, but it's exactly the opposite. I care so much about journalism. I think journalism is vital to democracy. I think journalists getting this right is a huge contributing factor to us getting to live in the world that we want to live in. So I want to start from that place because that's truly what I believe. But, you know, I had another column in the New Republic in 2021, and it ran during the second impeachment trial. And it was about how both sides' journalism and this view from nowhere and this idea that everything had to be neutral and that objectivity was real, how that was shattered when the journalists who were working in that building were at once chroniclers and survivors of the crime that was perpetrated by the Republican Party and the white nationalists who were energized on their behalf. And there is nothing that was more devastating or more depressing to me than January 6th. And when I wrote about that, and I wrote about the predicament that journalists found themselves in, that they as humans would be changed forever. You know, Peter Baker likes to say he doesn't want to vote because somehow being a journalist divorces him of his citizenship. This was the ultimate event that proved that that whole thing was a sham, right? And for journalists to constantly be the targets of death threats, for Republicans to have discredited them every step of the way, it was interesting because in that moment, I heard from a lot of reporters who were traumatized, reporters who were confused, reporters who were unsure if they were going to be able to continue in their work or how. And that was a time when they felt like they were really free to share that feedback. And because so many people have tried to move on from that moment, even though we're still subjected to it and we could still live through it again, I think some of that space and some of picking up the trappings of DC reporting and having some of that return to normal in a way that it wasn't during the Trump years has given them some comfort and space to try to snap back into what they felt like was regular, because that felt more comfortable than really living in the challenge and the difficulty of the moment that we find ourselves in.
Well, you got at the paradox there perfectly, because perversely enough, what that ends up doing is making it more likely that the insanity continues. Meredith Shiner, thanks so much for coming on with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Greg. I really appreciate it.
You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler and the DSR Network.